everybody. I'm really glad to be here. What a wonderful crowd we have tonight. This is great. My sobriety date is December 20th, 1964. I've been sober through the grace of God since that time. I'm extremely grateful for that. It's been a wonderful life. We're studying the Big Book together, and we're going to take the Big Book one word at a time, one phrase at a time, one sentence, one paragraph at a time. And this way we're going to find out exactly what's in there, but not only the individual words and phrases and sentences, but how all of these things tie together, because the Big Book is a mosaic. And many of the pieces don't seem to be in place because it was not written by someone who was used to writing a college textbook. The Big Book was written as a result of inspiration. Bill Wilson was once asked, where did the AA program come from? And he said it just grew by the grace of God. And so he knew, he understood where this came from. You remember that when he was writing the 12 steps, it took exactly 30 minutes, give or take a minute or two. And they'd never been written down before. And he didn't know what he was going to write when he started. And after 30 minutes, the 200 words which are changing the world were there on paper. And he reports that he looked up and there was God right up there in the second step. And then all the way through. And when he took this to the editorial board, some of them were quite concerned because there was so much God in the steps. And yet if you see the original steps and what they eventually came out with, they didn't really change much. It stayed the way Bill was inspired to write it. Now, that would not be as earth-shaking, but we're not for the fact that since the time those 12 steps were written, millions of people have recovered using those steps. AA flourishing, not because we're so great, not because of any wonders of organization, not because of any special merit that you and I have, but because the 12 steps work. And when we look at the Big Book, it's really, really important to understand that the Big Book is written to surround the steps, to explain the steps, and to give us the directions for working the steps. And if we look at it from any other standpoint, if we look at it as some kind of interesting reading or a philosophical treatise or something which might have sufficed to obtain a master's degree by some college student, we are completely deluding ourselves. And much of the time when people read the Big Book, they skim it and they do not read it, they do not parse the sentences, and they do not get the meaning. And consequently, there's an awful lot of misinformation floating around our rooms these days. Mythology, psychobabble, all kinds of stuff floating around have anything to do at all with recovery from alcoholism. And certainly they have nothing whatsoever to do with the Big Book or the program of recovery. There's a kind of little rule I'll pass on to you for whatever it's worth to you. It's always worked for me. When any time anyone tells you or suggests to you what you ought to do, you ask them, where is that in the Big Book? The other question is, where's God in that equation? If it's not in the book, and God's not in the equation, it's not AA. And there are a lot of folks who think that somehow or another this program evolves and grows as people become more and more modern and have more and more scientific facts and data at their fingertips. And that's fine. The problem is that when we look at the Big Book, we go back to this one simple fact. These 12 steps, you and me, in place of rebellion and defiance and denial when we walk in the door, full of fear and rage and anger and absolutely hopeless, feeling like we have been, we simply have lost in the game of life? How does it take us from a place of rebellion and defiance and denial to a place of surrender and obedience to the will of God? And we're going to find that out. This preface was written at the time of the publication of the third edition in 1976. Let's take a look at what this says, starting at the top of the page, XI 11. This is the third edition of the book Alcoholics Anonymous. The first edition appeared in April 1939, and in the following 16 years, more than 300,000 copies went into circulation. The second edition, published in 1955, reached a total of more than 1,150,000 copies. I don't know what the exact numbers are, but the third edition has, the last I heard, was well over 3 million copies. And of course, all of you know that the Big Book has been translated into 26 foreign languages, and that they're presently working on a translation for use in Central America, which would be in the Mayan tongue. Because of this, the growth of Alcoholics Anonymous over these 65 years has been nothing short of a total, complete miracle. There are millions who have recovered using the 12 steps. There are probably more than 5 million members now worldwide. Of course, as you can imagine, it's such a shifting population that it's impossible to get an accurate census. However, New York has a pretty good handle on it. When I came in, the membership was less than 200,000, about 180, 85,000. The growth has been exponential. We're growing by geometric progression, and it may well be that these 12 steps are the last great hope of the world. That's my personal opinion. Let's go on. Because this book has become the basic text for our society and has helped such large numbers of alcoholic men and women to recover, there exists a sentiment against any radical changes being made in it. Therefore, the first portion of this volume describing the AA recovery program has been left untouched in the course of revisions made for both second and third editions. The section called The Doctor's Opinion has been left intact, just as it was originally written in 1939 by the late Dr. William D. Silkworth, our society's great medical benefactor. Dr. Silkworth ought to have had the Nobel Prize for Medicine in the year 1939. He went as far out on a limb as you can go as a professional. At the time that he wrote that alcoholics suffered from a disease, this was something that was not even a matter of controversy. It was a matter of extreme derision among the medical people. It wasn't until 1947 that the American Medical Association decided that, yes, indeed, this was a disease, or at least a disease syndrome of some kind, and that it needed and to be incorporated in the studies for medical students. You will still run into doctors who have no idea that the added the appendices, the 12 traditions, and the directions for getting in touch with AA. The chief change was in the section on personal stories, which was expanded to reflect the fellowship's growth. Bill's story, Dr. Bob's nightmare, and one other personal history from the first edition were retained intact. 3 were edited, and one of these was retitled. New versions of 2 stories were written with new titles. 30 completely new stories were added, and the story section was divided into 3 parts under the same headings that are used now. In this third edition, Part 1, Pioneers of AA, stands unchanged. 9 of the stories in Part 2, They Stopped in Time, was carried over from the second edition, and 8 new stories have been added. In Part 3, they lost nearly all. 8 stories have been retained, 5 are new. All changes made over the years in the Big Book, AA members' fond nickname for this volume, have had the same purpose. Listen to this now: to represent the current membership of Alcoholics Anonymous more accurately, and thereby to reach more alcoholics. If you have a drinking problem, we hope that you may pause in reading one of the 44 personal stories and think, yes, that happened to me. Or more important, yes, I felt like that. Or most important, yes, I believe this program can work for me. And I know that there's some resistance to the idea of giving the Big Book to a new person and telling them read the book, the whole book. But you can see from this, I hope, that the entire book was written for the newcomer. And one of the most important things that we find in this book is that it will hopefully contain one or more stories with which that new person can identify themselves, where they can say, yes, I felt like that, or yes, I believe this program can work.
We're going to continue with it tonight. We'll find that in the beginning of the book, and it is on page 13. That's Roman 13, XIII. It's important to understand that the foreword to the first edition was not written by Bill Wilson as a part of the original text, the original manuscript. It was written after the editorial board had gotten through with the editing of the original manuscript. Now, there were very significant changes made in the original manuscript. Basically, what it amounted to was this. Bill, in writing the original, said, you got to do this, and you got to do that. And if you don't do this, then this is what's going to happen to you. When the editors got hold of this, they said, no, Bill, that's not what we want to do. We want to tell the people who read this book what we did. Not what they have to do, but what we did. Now you see then that the whole approach of the Big Book is this. Here were these folks, probably around 100 of them, who had recovered from a seemingly hopeless state of mind and body. Many of them had gone very far in their spiritual development and were already being able to be extremely helpful to the new people. Some of these folks hadn't even 6 months of sobriety yet. Stop and think about it. Every time you hear people around these rooms talk about you got to have 2 years to do so-and-so, or if you don't, all that stuff. Let me tell you, the longest sobriety in the fellowship, the time the Big Book was written, was a little over 3 years. And many of the people who helped to write this book didn't have a year yet, and some didn't even have 6 months yet. And yet, what they wrote for us has worked for 65 years. How come? How can that be? I mean, after all, they hadn't been sober that long, had they? The treasurer of my group had 4 months when she became treasurer. She's the best treasurer we ever had. Every time we put muzzle on anybody on the basis of time, we're making a terrible mistake, I believe. Certainly this did not apply to the people who wrote the book. So here's what was happening. They said, Bill, we want to have the book tell people who read it what we did, we recovered, and we believe that if they will do what we did, they too will recover. So let's tell them what we did. And let's make no bones about it. If you read this book, you won't find any weasel words in it. It doesn't equivocate, it doesn't beat around the bush. It tells you flat out, this is what we did, this is what worked for us. Because it did work for them. Now you can trust something, can't you? When people are not philosophizing or giving you their opinions, they're telling you what they did and what happened to them when they did it, and they're telling you that they recovered, get into in a week or two, ended up by saying you can trust everything these men say about themselves. And that's a wonderful epitaph. So when we read this forward, the first edition, let's understand that it was written after the Big Book was edited and just before it went to print, because they needed to state exactly what this book was all about and how it was written and what it was written for and what it was intended to accomplish. So let's look to see. We of Alcoholics Anonymous are more than 100 men and women who have recovered from a seemingly hopeless state of mind and body. You notice that they do not use the word saying in any way that they were cured of the disease of alcoholism. What they're saying is that they recovered from a seemingly hopeless state of mind and body. There's a whole big difference, because this hopeless state of mind and body is the symptomology of the disease. And they're saying these symptoms went away. They're gone. We have been enabled through God's grace to put all of these symptoms into remission. And though the disease is still there, it is no longer causing us any pain. It is no longer active. It's sitting back there perhaps waiting for us, but it is no longer disrupting our lives. It is no longer an active force in our lives. So, they also use the word seemingly hopeless, because obviously, if it were in fact hopeless, there'd be no reason for the book. What they're saying is, we walk in the door and we have this emptiness in the pit of our stomach that says, I can't do it. I can't recover. I can't stop drinking. My life is a mess, and it's always going to be. I have failed at almost everything I've tried in life, and I have failed over and over again in every attempt I've made to stop drinking. And I've made pledge after pledge and promise after promise. And I promised myself, and I promised my family, and I promised my employer, and I promised myself, and I promised God that I wouldn't drink anymore. And I couldn't stop. And maybe it's just because I'm crazy. Maybe I truly am insane. But I can't stop. And you folks, when I come in here, you say, we have a way for you to stop drinking. And so, if you did it, maybe there's some hope for me. Let's keep in mind that the two things that are the hallmarks of the incoming alcoholic, insofar as our program is concerned, are these. First of all, that person is almost always in a state of denial. That's because their minds don't work right. They're not willing, they cannot admit that they've been licked by alcohol. The prospect is just too horrible, that their lives are now gone. And so there's a denial, and that denial, that's why the Big Book right here in the front addresses this question of hopelessness, and it calls it a seemingly hopeless state of mind and body. The next sentence tells us precisely why this book was written. You see, they got it right up front here, so there can be no mistake. And this is something we have to carry with us as we read the book, so we'll understand what we're reading. To show other alcoholics precisely how we have recovered is the main purpose of this book. We wrote this book specifically to lay out for each of you the instructions for working this program precisely as we did so, in the belief that if you do that, you too will recover. And so when we approach the Big Book, the rest of the book, as we go through it together from that standpoint, it'll make it sure that we're all on the same page. Going on. Now this is talking about other alcoholics. For them, we hope these pages will prove so convincing that no further authentication will be necessary. What does that mean? Well, here's the way it was. In the times that this book was being written, there were only the three little groups. They knew that if this thing caught on, it was going to be all over the place. And they had in mind that it was going to be all over the world at some time. And of course, it turned out to be that that's exactly what happened. And so they're saying, we hope that if you pick this book up and read it, that you won't need anything further from us, that you will believe what you read, and that you will take what we have given you and use it for yourself. But it goes even further than that. Because when we get back to the 11th chapter, we're going to find that what they're really doing here is first they're showing other alcoholics how they recover. Then they're showing other alcoholics how they can get other people to recover. And then in chapter 11, they're showing us how we can get groups together, how we can help AA grow within our own area. Because you see what they had in mind here was we can't go out and do this, there are too few of us. But if we write a book which will go from alpha to omega, from A to Z, cover everything that we know, and including helping people who are out there in Cucamonga, California, after they have gotten a few people sober, that a bunch of them can get together and form a group. That's why in chapter 11 it talks about it first. And then Bill and Bob went and they got Bill D. And then the three of them went and got this, I forget this guy's name, he was a crazy man. But the four of them were now sober. And Bill went back to New York. The other three stayed in Akron, and they started forming a group in Akron. And Bill went to New York, and he started doing the same thing in New York, and pretty soon there were two groups. And they show us in the 11th chapter how to do that. So when you think about why this book was written, remember that it's taking us through this entire odyssey. How you and I can recover, how we can help others recover, and once having done that, how we can perpetuate the program by setting up the groups from the people that we've helped. And then it spreads out from there. Clarence Snyder once said that the unity in AA, he said, is chaos. Chaos. He said, if you don't like what's going on in your group, get a pot of coffee, a Bigbook, and another one that agrees with you, and go get your own meeting going. And that really works. So they're saying that they hope that the person, when you and I pick up this book, and if we could place ourselves back in 1940, for example, we pick up this book and we wouldn't need to have the testimony from 1,000 psychiatrists and 1,400 ministers and ministers of state and the Secretary of State and the President of the United States and all these people saying, oh, this is the greatest thing since sliced bread, you better do it. No further authentication. Pick it up, see that we know what we're talking about, see that you believe that we recovered, and therefore you believe that if what you do what we did, you too can recover. And that's all this account of our experiences will help everyone to better understand the alcoholic. Now that's a kind of interesting statement. It comes right up here in the front of the forward of the first edition. Why would they do that? Well, we have to understand what they had in mind at the time. You see, they felt that this book had a major mission in terms of educating non-alcoholics to what our problem is. Not only to what our problem is, but what the remedy is, and also, and there is a way in which they can be of help in that recovery process. In fact, you know, we've got a whole chapter to the whys, and to a large extent it deals with the wife's place in this whole recovery process. Not only for the alcoholic, but alcoholism was a family disease, and if you read chapter 11, you're going to find what it tells you there, that they met together as families. It even says if you're out in Cucamonga, California, and you get a few families in recovery, not alcoholics, but families, that then you can go forward and get some groups going. And remember, in those days, they met in each other's homes. About once a week, they tried to have a meeting where everybody was invited to come and find out what it was all about. And so what it's saying here is that they're hoping that this book will go out and it will be read by the doctors and the psychiatrists, and read by the ministers and the educators and the professors and the employers and the members of the families, and that by reading this book they will better come to understand the alcoholic, and maybe, just maybe, take some of the onus off of the disease and take some of the pressure off the people who are trying to recover. It's a plea for better understanding of what's going on with us. Now remember, at the time this was written, there was no unanimity of opinion as to what was wrong with us. Most people still considered the alcoholic to be a lost soul, a bad person, a weak person, even perhaps a damned person, exhibiting the dark side, no doubt crazy, to be locked away, to be hidden away, to be shunned, to be laughed at, but not treated, not understood. And they're saying, we hope, we pray, that if you read this, perhaps you'll have a better understanding of what's really going on here. And of course, that's exactly what has happened. Many do not comprehend that the alcoholic is a very sick person. Now, this was way ahead of its time. You probably remember that the first time that the American Medical Association agreed that alcoholism is a disease was 1947. And this was written in 1939, so it was to be 8 more years before the official imprimatur of disease was placed upon alcoholism. So you can see there was an 8-year hiatus in there. And yet these guys were saying, there's no doubt in our minds, we're very sick people, and everybody out there who is suffering from this disease is a very sick person. And we hope that you'll come to understand and believe that. They had no way of knowing that the medical profession would finally wake up, or that suddenly insurance companies were going to get stuck with to set up a national council on alcoholism. You remember that? They did a lot of damage too, because they were always out there searching for people that they could euchre into going back to Washington and getting on committees and getting on television and stuff, and a lot of those people got drunk. But the official recognition of this disease and the fact that Alcoholics Anonymous was actually working, that people were getting sober that would never have had a chance to get sober before, the lost people, the lost souls. Wow. And so here they're coming right out and saying that many do not comprehend that the alcoholic is a very sick person. Not bad. Not a bad person. Might be a little bit screwy. And of course we all know just how nutty we were when we got here. Our minds didn't work right. But that didn't mean that we could only recover if we got shot up with all kinds of medications or popped a whole bunch of pills or laid around on somebody's couch for 6 years. For most of us, that's never necessary. Necessary is for us to go from a place of rebellion and defiance to a place of surrender, and we let God do the work because He's promised that He will, if we let Him. And then this next sentence, again, understanding just how deeply these people were involved in the mission that they had. Besides, we are sure that our way of living has its advantages for all. I want to show you where that pops up big time in the Big Book. And you may be surprised where we're going to find this. Turn to page 116. That's going to be over a year before we get here again, but we might refer back to this. And remember that this chapter was written by Bill Wilson after Lois turned him down. And he's masquerading here as a white. And it's probably the only lie in the Big Book. Bill Wilson in drag. The second full paragraph. Now, this is supposedly a wife talking. This is Bill Wilson instructing us and instructing the non-alcoholics who read this book. Listen to what he says. We have elsewhere remarked how much better life is when lived on a spiritual plane. If God can solve the age-old riddle of alcoholism, He can solve your problems too. Whoa, wait a minute. We're talking about this sick alcoholic here. What are you talking about me? I got no problems. I mean, the only problems I have is because he's been a drunk and he hasn't paid the bills and he's brought all these strange people in my house. And there's nothing wrong with me. But wait a second. We wives found that, like everybody else, that's an interesting phrase, like everybody else, isn't it? That means everybody. What part of everybody don't we understand? In French, tout le monde, the whole world. We wives found that, like everybody else, we were afflicted with pride, self-pity, vanity, and all the things which go to make up the self-centered person, and we were not above selfishness or dishonesty. Now we got to remember that all of these things which we've just listed are the hallmarks of the alcoholic. These are our defects. We don't have to share them with this person over here, but no, but she's got them, and he's got them, and they've got them. Selfishness, self-centeredness, that we think is the root of our problem. Driven by 100 forms of fear, self-delusion, self-pity, self-seeking, and I forget the other one. We tread on the toes of our fellows and they retaliate, sometimes seemingly without provocation, but we invariably find that at some time in the past we've made decisions based on self which left us in a position to be hurt. Selfishness is the root of our trouble. Now, if that's the root of our trouble, and if we know, for example, that pride is the godfather of all of our defects, if we know that fear, which is the product of pride, if dishonesty, let's just take another example here. When we read chapter 5, the first paragraph in chapter 5 tells us what? That if we cannot be honest with ourselves, we can't recover. So what we're looking at here is a statement which, if you believe it, and I do, tells us that everybody out there needs what we have been given. They all need the 12 steps. And that is literally so. The fact of the matter is the 12 steps are for everybody. The problem there is that you have to be powerfully driven in order to be willing to work them. Because it requires of us that we put aside all the old ideas. Everything I knew when I got here was wrong. I'd start all over again. We have to learn from the beginning. We have to put aside childish things. We have to get off the playground and out of the sandbox and grow up and be adults and take responsibility for our actions and take responsibility for what happens to us. Begin to be productive adults, productive human beings, seeking and doing God's will. And the process of doing that means we have to get down and dirty about ourselves, not only with ourselves and with God, but with another human being. And not a lot of people are willing to do that. But if they do, and of course this is the hallmark of the Al-Anon, for example. The Al-Anon people use these steps. And they found right here that this is what they must do. So let's go back over here on to the forward of the first editions. See that sentence again. Now we understand what they're saying. And besides, we are sure that our way of living has its advantages for all. Going on in the second paragraph, it is important that we remain anonymous because we are too few at present to handle the overwhelming number of personal appeals which may result from this publication. I've got to ask you something. Do you see one word of fear there? Do you see anything that would even suggest that they were afraid of being ratted out or recognized or demeaned before the public as being these dissolute alcoholics? No, they weren't dealing with fear. This is a very practical matter. They're saying there's no way in the world that we could even begin to try to deal with the vast number of inquiries and the cries for help, which are going to come. We're going to have to find a better way to do it. And of course, that's exactly what happened. The personal appeals. Being mostly business and professional folk, we could not well carry on our occupations in such an event. We would like it understood that our alcoholic work is an avocation. Now, avocation in this sense does not mean something that we do as a hobby. It means that we all have work we must do. We have to support our families. But we're going to devote a substantial part of our lives to doing the work of this program. What we're asking for is that you be willing to recognize our need to be able to live our lives at some modicum of normalcy. And so we're not going to publicize our last names, but there's more to it than that. It's very important because it goes to the heart of the traditions. In 1840, there was a bunch called the Washingtonian Society. And these people had gotten together. In fact, it's kind of an interesting story. There's a monograph out right now, which I think you can get on the internet, which tells the history of the Washingtonian movement. There were 6 guys sitting around a table just like this, all getting drunk one night. And so they decided, well, let's get sober. So they decided that they would all get sober after that night, and they made a pact to form a group, and they called themselves the Washingtonians. And their whole idea was that you could only stay sober if you abstained entirely from drinking alcohol. Now, this was something which was you would think, well, that's obvious, right? But it wasn't obvious in the 1840s. In fact, the temperance movement didn't say anything about don't drink. It said drink moderately. Use temperance when you drink. And the temperance movement was all through all of the churches. That's what happened with these guys. They got entree to the congregations of hundreds of churches. And they would be invited to come in and they would preach their story of sobriety. And then they would get everybody to come up to the front of the church and sign a pledge not to drink. And they prospered. They had over 100,000 members within 6 years. But these guys were out there promoting themselves big time. My name is Jim Bramble, and I am one of the founders of the Washingtonian Society. Now, all of you people listen to me. The devil is in you. We're here to save your soul. The snake dancers will come out. Every Chautauqua stand, they were on every stump and every pulpit they could find. And so everybody knew who they were, and the people who followed, the lieutenants who followed along after them, they got their names out there. And of course they were collecting a whole bunch of money. Nobody knows for sure what happened to all. They were self-supporting through your contributions, the way it worked out. Well, you see, what happened was that because they didn't keep their last names anonymous, and because they publicized themselves, they all got drunk. And everybody knew that these founders who were so holy about this whole thing, so religious, so dedicated to the idea of sobriety, they all got drunk. And so the Washingtonians just fell apart. Well, our guys knew all about this. They knew the dangers of using their last name. Now, what happened there is that when it came time in 1945 for Bill to write the traditions, you see, that 12th tradition was the natural outgrowth of this understanding that anonymity is the spiritual foundation of all of our traditions, ever reminding us to place principles before personalities. And the whole concept behind the 12th tradition is sacrifice. Or you can read that humility if you wish, but not fear. It's got nothing to do with fear. It's got nothing to do with our fear that somebody might know that we're members here, that we're alcoholics. And so we need to kind of think about that, because we get off half-cocked with that anonymity thing big time when we consider that it somehow has to do with the fear of discovery. It does have to do with our personal choice. If I wish to remain anonymous, you have absolutely no right to ever break my anonymity. But I have every right to break it if I wish. But if I break it at the level of press, radio, films, and TV, I'm putting myself in grave danger. Because I'm back into the old power driving game. I'm back in asking for people to admire me and to think I'm such a wonderful guy. Look at him. He had such a tough time and now he's sober, and look at all the wonderful things he's doing. Let's give him a university grant and let's put him to work over here for Budweiser, and he can tell everybody how to drink wine. But you see, that's where it all leads, isn't it? The moment that we get away from sacrificing our need to be recognized and to be admired, which is a normal, natural need we have, the moment that we approach this from the standpoint of humility, we assure our own sobriety, and we not only do that, but we assure the continued unity of the fellowship. So that's what it's all about. So it goes beyond the fact that these guys were business people and they didn't want to be overwhelmed with requests for help. And as the society matured, and by the time the traditions were being adopted in 1950, it was really a settled proposition by that time. And that 12th tradition was easily accepted. Speaking publicly about alcoholism, we urge each of our fellowship to omit his personal name, designate himself as a member of Alcoholics Anonymous. Now, of course, you can see that that is the root of the 11th tradition, right? Everybody? Okay. But there's more to it too. This is kind of a cute little thing. There are people who come in here who say, "Well, I don't know whether I'm an alcoholic or not." And everybody leaps on them, you know, they're going to be deluged after the meeting. "You ain't think this is some kind of a bingo game? You know. This is not an Elks meeting." We want them to own up to the fact that they're alcoholics. It's the same thing that we used to do when we were drinking. We want everybody to drink with us. And we had some poor slob who was our good friend and didn't want to drink. We'd badger him until he took a drink. And when people are sitting around here with us, we want them to all be alcoholics. Now, is there anything in the Big Book that says, or in the traditions that says, that when I get up here and I say, "My name is Jim," that I'm likewise required to say, "and I'm an alcoholic"? No. What's it say here? All I have to do is introduce myself as a member of Alcoholics Anonymous. That's what the Big Book says, and I believe it. Now, whether there would be some therapeutic value in terms of the first step, I'm not going to argue in terms of admitting that I'm an alcoholic, but I think 99% of the time we do that just out of peer pressure, just because we don't want to be different. It's just because the moment that we forget to do that, somebody's going to say, "What are you? Who are you and what are you? You think you're going to share around here without saying you're an alcoholic? Forget it, son. It isn't going to happen." You know, we get into some weird stuff. They verge on the ridiculous. And yet they're so commonly used that we just accept them as being, I don't know, I guess having some solid foundation in fact. But they don't. So we get, if somebody's new and they don't want to say I'm an alcoholic, tell them that's okay. Read the forward of the first edition, first page, that's page 13, XIII, it'll tell you what you need to say. I'm a member of Alcoholics Anonymous. And then I'm going to explain to this new person, you're a member when you say you are, and nobody can say you're not. Isn't that screwy too? I mean, whoever heard of a society, any group of people that band together, let alone millions of people, who live by the maxim that anybody can be a member of this group simply by saying they are, who can form a kangaroo court. The Oxfordians used to do this. They'd have a table like this, people sitting around, then they'd set the poor sucker right here, and then they'd start questioning him, you know. And they would decide as kind of a jury as to whether it was okay for him to stick around. Early New York group, you used to have to give them your financial statement. They weren't going to take any bum off the street. But you know, we got over that, didn't we? The only place in the world that you can go and you are a member just because you say you are, and nobody say you're not. And you think, well, that'll never work. It'll never work. No other group of people in the world is organized that way or disorganized that way. It'll never work. That's right. It'll never work, right? Everybody here can understand that, but why are we here? Why does it work? Why? It's very simple. I believe, and I hope you do too. These traditions are spiritual principles, and they are paradoxes, and when we get in here, we learn that we have to live by paradox, not by what we thought was right, but what we now come to find is right. The next to the last full paragraph. Now this paragraph covers something which came up just tonight, and apparently what happened was that somebody did something heroic or whatever, or saved somebody's life, and then was asked about and why did you do that, and this person said, well, I'm a member of Alcoholics Anonymous. And this became a sort of a cause célèbre around town here, and some of the meetings have been questioning whether that was the right thing to do, or whether it was a violation of the 11th tradition. Let's read what it tells us here, because this paragraph has been restated in the 11th tradition. When writing or speaking publicly about alcoholism, we urge each of our fellowship to omit his personal name, designating himself instead as a member of Alcoholics Anonymous. Notice the language, speaking publicly about alcoholism, writing or speaking publicly. When we look at the 11th tradition, we're looking at the imprimatur there that we are not to reveal our last names in radio, press, or films, and of course we can add TV to that. Now there's a reason for this tradition. It's not something which is really obvious. It hasn't anything to do at all with the fact that somebody might get out there and besmirch the name of the fellowship. These people weren't dealing from fear. They were dealing on an entirely different basis, a spiritual basis. If you look at the 12th tradition, you see what that spiritual basis is. That anonymity is the spiritual foundation of all of our traditions, ever reminding us to put principles before personalities, which means that we are to be willing to sacrifice our natural instinct, our natural desire for notoriety and acclaim. We're to subjugate that to the necessity of the unity of the fellowship, and also for our own survival, because this is the way that we can practice humility. So the 12th tradition has to do with humility, and so therefore we're really talking about not only the unity of the fellowship, but also about the survival of the individual. Because if you stop and think about it, if I am practicing the kind of self-centeredness and egoism and pride that drives me to identify myself as a member of AA and to then pontificate about the program, letting everybody know just exactly what it's all about and what my opinions are, I've done a great disservice not only to AA but to myself. But there's an even earlier problem which is covered by this That problem began clear back in 1840 with the Washingtonians, who went around from every Chautauqua stump they could find and every church pulpit they could get crammed into, preaching the gospel of abstinence from alcohol, being supported by the temperance movement and by the churches who were the prime ingredients of the temperance movement. And these guys are getting up there and taking full credit for everything and announcing their full names. And after about 6 years, this whole thing folded. It simply fell on its sword. And they believed, and I think they're right, that there was a big part of that El Foldo that the Washingtonians went through was simply because their leaders did not understand that it was necessary for them to stay out of the limelight, carry the message, and not try to achieve some kind of personal notoriety and a guru status and so on. And also, by the way, the 12th tradition. At the very beginning, next paragraph, very earnestly we ask the press also to observe this request, for otherwise we shall be greatly handicapped. And you know what happened was that the press honored that. In fact, if you read some of the literature, you'll find that some of the guys wanted to have their names out. They wanted the press, they wanted the notoriety, and they'd be reminded by the reporters, hey, we're not supposed to do that. We're not supposed to use your last name. We've been asked not to do it. But there's an even bigger and more important aspect to this. Can you imagine the average reporter who is dealing with human avarice and people out there constantly seeking to better themselves, to gain press, to get notoriety, and they're used to that. And they're being chased around. People are trying to get their picture in the paper, trying to get an article or a story about themselves, especially if they've got some kind of a thing that they're trying to push. And hey, just exactly the opposite. We're saying that we don't want people out there to know who we are by our last name. We want them to know about the fellowship. We want them to know about a program of recovery which works. And the press said they eat this up, man, because they could begin to trust us. We didn't want anything from them. Same way with the foundations, with the government and big business. We never ask them for anything. They trust us. We've got no axe to grind. We're not seeking anything from anybody. We're self-supporting through our own contributions. We keep to ourselves. We keep our heads down, our mouths closed, and we go about the business of helping other alcoholics to achieve sobriety. No wonder they trust us. No wonder this fellowship has the highest kind of a reputation. You see, what's happened here is that these traditions have placed us in a position which is bar none. Not mean that the average Joe lunch bucket out there doesn't have some queasy idea about AA, a bunch of drunks sitting around. Probably wouldn't want to get hooked up with that bunch. But the people who could otherwise cause us great difficulty, the religious people, the ministers and rabbis and priests and bishops, they have no bone to pick with us. The people in government, they have no bone to pick with us. Even the American Gestapo, the IRS, has no bone to pick with us. They leave us the hell alone. Can you imagine that? And we're not exactly totally kosher about that, because we do a lot of stuff that they could really rack us up for if they want to. They just leave us alone. This is the reputation that we have achieved and which we deserve. I suppose if one were to be really honest about it, one would have to say that the greatest social problem in the United States today, perhaps in the whole world, is alcoholism and drug addiction. I doubt very much if there's anything that even comes close to that now. And yet, what is the single organization in all the world that offers
a can't-miss solution to the alcoholic. That's us. You say, well, wait a second there, Jim. What are you talking about, can't miss? I mean it. Don't take my word for it. Take the word of Dr. Bob Smith, an honest man if there ever was one. Dr. Bob had a reputation in the fellowship for probity second to none. And what did he say when he wrote his story for the Big Book? It's right there for us to read anytime we want to open up and read Dr. Bob's story. What's he say? He's talking now about the 12 steps and the program of recovery of Alcoholics Anonymous, and he says, it never fails. What part of never don't we understand? It never fails if we go about it with one half the zeal we used to go about getting our next drink. And he's right. How could it be that the mind of man would come up with something that never fails? Aha! You see, that's the point, isn't it? This wasn't the mind of man. This is one of the reasons that we know that in a million years we come up with this ourselves. Everything that the mind of man can conceive of, if it's carried out to its ultimate conclusion, will fail. But not so with what God inspires. Somebody asked me yesterday, don't you find a lot of the Bible being quoted or plagiarized in the Big Book? And I said, I don't know about plagiarized, but let's see, I find the Proverbs, I find the Psalms, I find the book of James, I find a letter to the Ephesians, letter to the Romans, I find a lot of what Luke wrote. But then if one goes to the Koran, one's going to find the same stuff. Go to the Talmud, you're going to find the same stuff. Look at some of the Eastern religions and you'll find the same things. And I said to him, and I believe this now, and you may not, but I believe this. I said, the Big Book and all these other things we're talking about had the same author. That can't be plagiarism. Inspiration is inspiration, no matter where you find it. I wrote the 12 Steps for Christians for a friend of mine who was a Baptist minister. He couldn't get anybody sober, bringing them into his office. They were all doing all the Christian stuff, and they had done everything, and they were still getting drunk. And he came to a few meetings at my house, and he asked me, what's different here? And I said, what's different is that we have a program of 12 steps which shows and teaches people how to take these principles and put them to work in their lives. They don't just have to say, yeah, I agree that that's right, and then leave the church and say, but how do I do it? See what we have here, guys? We've got the great spiritual principles that have been around forever, restated as steps of action, which means that if we take these steps, if we put them to work in our lives, we incorporate these great spiritual principles into our very being. They become a part of us. They become the way we live our lives. Now there's no mystery about how do I live a moral life. If you want to extend that to a Christian life or a Jewish life or any other kind of life which is required by any religion, we find exactly the same thing. And the 12 Steps for Christians being used in my friend's rectory office, people began to get sober and stay sober. And so he was amazed. And you know, it shouldn't amaze anybody, and yet you and I have something here which is so unique, and it works so well that folks out there really don't want to believe it. They need to come around and watch the light come back into people's eyes. They need to see people recovering from a disease which is incurable. On that page, we're going to find some more of the original concepts behind the traditions. Right at the bottom of the page. We are not an organization in the conventional sense of the word. Boy, is that never an understatement. Do you, if any of you belong to, let's say, the Lions or the Elks or the Masons, or you belong to your union, or to a VA thing, or any of that, you know that every organization out there have rules and regulations, right? They usually have like bylaws, and then they've got all these people who are in charge. And then the people in charge are given power. And the power can be exercised by them. And when they run for office because they want to have the prestige of being an officer, and then they like the power they get. And everybody accepts this. We give these people power. They wouldn't have it otherwise, of course. But now look at AA. You know, the guy who wrote The Brewmeister, Clarence Snyder, a friend of mine, he was a real good friend of mine until he went kind of nutty about religion, but up until that time he was a real sensible guy. And one of the things he'd say when he would speak is, he says, unity in AA is chaos. And I remember my first night when I came in, I looked around, I could see that nobody was in charge. And I figured I would be president of this chicken outfit in about 6 months. There wasn't anybody running stuff. And so we're not a conventional organization in any sense of the word. If you want to be truly stymied, if you'd like to have all your expectations dashed, if you'd like to be completely frustrated by the lack of power, just become an AA politician. Yeah, go to district and enjoy the debating society there, and then go to area, and that's an even bigger debating society. And then you've worked very, very hard. You've got about 14 years sobriety, and suddenly you find yourself a delegate in New York. And that's a huge debating society. But the bottom line is that there is no power there to say anything to this group. You cannot be directed by anybody in the chain of command, because there's no command. Everybody who is doing these things is a trusted servant, and you and I conduct the affairs of our groups in accordance with God's will as it is expressed through our group conscience. Period. Now that won't work. Of course, there are some groups which have to go a little bit further, and sometimes they get pretty far out. And I'm not going to say anything more about that, because I know this group does some of the stuff I was going to criticize. Why don't we stop and think, for instance, that half the people who wrote the Big Book didn't have a year's sobriety yet, and many of them didn't have 6 months. I don't know. Sometimes I think we maybe go a little bit too far in trying to protect our own interests. That may perhaps be part of our selfishness syndrome. I'm not sure. Or maybe it's just kind of like habit, or it's traditional. I don't know. But there just is. There's no time limit on recovery. I've seen people with a full-blown spiritual awakening after being here 30 days. In fact, I know a lot of them. I know a lot of them are sober right now. And they have a great message. So I think sometimes we forget that the whole idea here is that we don't have any rules and regulations, that man-made rules and regulations are going to be unhandy at the very least, and perhaps totally unworkable in the light of fees or dues whatsoever. Whoever heard of that? I mean, how can you have an organization and not pick people's pockets? How can you have an organization where you do not get money out of people through fear? And I'm not just talking about the Elks and Rotarians either. I mean, you go to any organization put together by humans, and it has to be supported. Now, how are we going to get the money out of people? We make sure that they are afraid not to give it to us. And we don't do that. Every dime that comes in, it comes in because it is voluntarily given. It's almost like, it's like the love that we have for, not only for our fellows here, but for those who are to come. You know, we look forward, we look to the future many times because we're building for the future. And the future for us is composed of those out there who haven't gotten sober yet. Those out there who have not had the opportunity to have God come into their lives. You know, this is our responsibility, and we're perfectly willing to support that responsibility, because you see, each of us has been granted a great miracle. Many miracles. And for every one of us in here, just look around you, for every one of us in here, there are 10 people out there who have never made it. Why? Why us? I guess the best that we can do is say, thank you, God. I'm going to do I don't know why you chose me, what to do, but I'm ever grateful because I want to do it. And then I'll have real freedom. So we don't collect any money as fees or dues. And you know, people coming in here have a hard time accepting that. We got to have something that we're looking for from them. What do you want from me? What do I have to do? If you don't want money, what do I do community service in your club room? Or what is it that you want from me? Nothing. Nothing whatsoever. We don't want a thing from you except your willingness to hear what we have to tell you and show you and to help you do. And if you're willing to do that, we believe that you can have a life beyond your wildest dreams just as we with you, and we'll tell you why. The Big Book tells us this in Bill's story. If an alcoholic fails to enlarge and perfect his spiritual life through work and self-sacrifice for others, he cannot survive the certain low spots ahead. So my survival depends, isn't it strange? My survival depends upon your willingness to honor me with your trust and allow me to carry my message to you, the message that I've been given. Because if I'm not able to do that, if I'm not able to give back, if I'm not able to work and self-sacrifice in this fellowship, my two sponsors, Father Joe and Admiral Bud Scholes, these guys met me outside the meeting room and they said, "Get in the car, kid." I was young enough then to be still called a kid by these guys. And they drove me downtown. We went downtown Los Angeles up the 5th floor of an old hotel. And there was a guy in the bed, you know, and he'd called for help. And one of those guys, I think it was Joe, had a pint or a half pint of Tin High in his back pocket. So the fellow was shaking pretty bad, so they gave him a couple of snorts and he kind of quieted down. And then they sat there for an hour and a half and talked to him. And he wasn't buying any of it. He just kept looking to see where that bottle was coming out again. So after about an hour and a half, they had me sitting over in a corner and we left. And I said, well, I don't understand this. This guy didn't want to hear anything you had to say. What in the world are we doing here? And Bud turned to me and said, "Jim, you just don't understand. We're not here for him. We're here for ourselves. We're here for ourselves because we trust that God will supply the result. Our job is to carry the message. And when we carry the message, we grow spiritually and we stay sober. And if God so wills it, the man we're talking to may hear us, maybe not for another year, but we planted seeds, hopefully, and maybe someday, if it's God's will for this man, those seeds will take root. And we've done our job. We've done our part. We've done what we have committed ourselves to do. We've carried the message. Now, we get to be social, you see, that we have almost word for word now in our traditions. The only requirement for membership is an honest desire to stop drinking. And when I first read that, I said, well, you can't have a dishonest desire. That wouldn't be a desire at all, would it? So, of course, in the tradition, they took out that word honest. Now, this is very, very, very important. Stop and think about it. Here we are in 1939. They've only been around about, Dr. Bob's been sober almost 4 years. Bill's been sober a little over. And they've already come to the conclusion that they were not going to be able to dictate the terms of membership. Because how do you describe those terms? One of the things they had found that the various groups had already set up their own rules for membership, and some of them were quite restrictive. And when you added them all together and put them in one package, they found that none of the original members could have become a member. They wouldn't have been able to qualify. And of course they got a lot of this stuff from the Oxfordians, because the Oxfordians they had a little different thing. They had a kind of a circle that you had, you got the chair sitting here and all these people staring at you, sitting over here asking you questions. Sort of a kangaroo court kind of thing, before they'd allow you to be a member. The people in New York they thought this was great because they didn't want any of these bums off the street. I think they were even asking for financial statements at one time, and they weren't about to have their group polluted by these rotten, nasty, drunk type people, forgetting, of course, where they came from. In the 12 and 12, none of that. In the third tradition, we have the story, which I've been told is true, about the man who came and asking for help. Excuse me. Telling him that he had a problem that was even more stigmatized than alcoholism. And he said to them, if you don't help me, I'm sure to die. And so they didn't know what to do. So they got 3 of the elders in the group together, and they had them sit down and try to work this thing out. One of the guys suggested, well, it would be better if we let this one go, and he may die, but it's better that one should die than many should live, which is kind of a triage type of thing, I guess. And they weren't comfortable with that, I'm sure. They were afraid that what the Big Book calls, or what the 12 and 12 calls, a strange alcoholic. They were afraid of what he might do to the reputation of this fellowship, and they were afraid that this was not somebody they could help. And then one of the guys said, these words have been running through my mind, and I can't get them out of my mind. The words are, what would the master do? And that was the end of the discussion. Now it so happens that this fellow was brought into the fellowship, and he became a very valuable member of the fellowship, helped a whole lot of people. There's a lesson there for us somewhere, and sometimes I think we forget it. Maybe because somehow or another we get the idea that we own the 12 steps, or that we got some kind of a patent on recovery. I'm not sure. But know this for a fact, that the only requirement for membership is a desire to stop drinking, which means quite simply this: you are a member when you say you are. And it does not mean that you have to say anything about it. Does not mean you have to speak up in meetings and say, my name is Jim, I'm an alcoholic. We talked about this last week. I can say, my name is Jim and I'm a member of Alcoholics Anonymous. And nobody can question it. Now, as a result of that, quite obviously, we have many people in our fellowship who are not alcoholics. But they're perfectly welcome. There are many people who come in the door and they have a desire to stop drinking. They're hard drinkers. But the Big Book says about these folks, they can stop or modify, given the proper motivation to do so. But nevertheless, they're welcome as members. Because, stop and think about the opposite. How would you set up some kind of a criteria by which you would deny membership to anybody? do we have some sort of a mental x-ray machine that will go to the, are we gonna give people lie detector tests? All right, do you mean to say that you are really an alcoholic? You didn't pass the test, you have to leave. We don't have a way to do that, do we? Now, there are some people who think some kind of a written examination would fill the bill. In fact, I can think of some stuff I've seen floating around that comes out of treatment centers that will prove that you're an alcoholic or not. I question that. And then there is another technique which is being used these days, which is rather amazing. The idea being that if your life is unmanageable, you must be an alcoholic. Now, how in the world do we get to that? Good Lord, there are billions of people out there whose lives are not manageable and they're not alcoholics. That's not an indicia of anything except that we got an unmanageable life. So what? That's got nothing to do with alcoholism. It just happens to be a fact. Most people who are alcoholics... So we don't have any way of testing this, do we? So we don't. We don't. We trust God. Believe this now. We trust God to bring the people in the door who belong here. Whether we would agree with that or not becomes totally irrelevant. And some of the people who come in that door who are not alcoholics become some of our greatest members. People who do so much for others. People who become true servants of their higher power. We just don't know when that's going to happen, and it's not for us to judge. And so the only requirement for membership is the desire to stop drinking. You are a member when you say you are, period.